Well, hello everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here today. I think over the last 3 or 4 years, David and I and the NCEA team have had a huge number of discussions about how we can evolve the NCEA so that it really meets the needs of the ELM program and will help us to evaluate our schemes. And to be here today and see all of these products and have this discussion is really exciting. So I'm a Deputy Director heading up the evidence and analysis function in the Farming and Countryside program. I know we have a very wide set of backgrounds in the room today from across government and across public and private sectors. So just really quickly, a very rapid bit of context about the farming reforms. There is an absolutely huge transformation underway in agricultural policy in England, prompted by two things really, prompted by EU exit, first and foremost, but also prompted by the Environment Act, which set very stretching and ambitious targets for the environment in England. And of course, agricultural land is a large majority of how we use land in England. And so a more or less total redesign of domestic agricultural policy has been undertaken over the last few years. Area-based subsidies are being withdrawn, and that budget has been largely repurposed towards, as Gideon mentioned earlier, public money for public goods, with essentially at the agricultural sector and farmers being asked to deliver a huge quantity to some of our most stretching Environment Act targets. So in that context, the government has introduced environmental land management schemes. This is a suite of agri-environment schemes. Now we've been doing agri-environment schemes in England for many decades, but the environmental land management schemes is a total redesign of how we approach those schemes and a huge expansion in terms of the budget that will be going into them and in terms of the breadth of the offer. And these schemes pay farmers and land managers to maintain sustainable farming and land management practices. And what we're trying to juggle in the ELM schemes is a huge expansion in the environmental delivery and how farmers are stewarding their land, whilst also supporting food production and improving productivity. And I think we did cover in some of the earlier sessions some of the win-win opportunities here, which is where farmers look after their natural capital, there are benefits for the business. And that's one of the things that we're trying to draw out as we design the ELM schemes, and one of the things that our data will hopefully show. But there's a great deal of opportunity for farmers, not just to derive an income opportunity from the environmental land management schemes, but also some of the improved land management practice that we're funding through the schemes can improve the resilience of their farming practice to drought, to climate change, to extreme weather, whilst also helping diversify their farm income. So what I want to tell you a little bit about is how we're planning to use the NCEA data to evaluate the most universal of our ELM schemes, which is the Sustainable Farming Incentive. This was introduced as a pilot back in 2021 and then expanded and offered at scale in 2022. And each year since then, we've added to it and iterated the scheme. Very recently, over the summer, we've launched the fully expanded version of the SFI, which now includes 102 actions, including some very innovative things that we've never previously offered in schemes, such as agroforestry. We've also revamped and fundamentally redesigned a large quantity of the offer. So you might ask, do we need field data to assess the ELM schemes? There is a huge amount of existing environmental science that underpins what we've put into the ELM schemes. We haven't put anything into the ELM schemes that we didn't have a good scientific evidence base to suggest it was a good idea, that it would deliver effectively towards our targets. But we do, of course, need to visit our sites as farmers implement their agreements. The reason for that is that whilst we have very good evidence on individual actions, it's a totally different question to assess the cumulative impact of a suite of actions through a scheme. There's also a huge variety and diversity of farming systems, agricultural land, and the environmental context and habitat context in which that land sits. So we do, of course, over the years that follow as we roll out the ELM schemes, need a field-based approach to assessing impact, so that we can quite rapidly tweak and iterate our scheme design, but also report to the public, to ministers, to Parliament about what we've delivered through the through the interventions. So those of you who are from an evidence background will be familiar with the logic model. We obviously have a logic model for our monitoring approach in the ELM schemes. What I just want to point out to begin with is that we all know that collecting environmental data is painstaking. It takes a very long time. It takes a huge effort. And the outcomes that we're trying to measure don't necessarily materialize very quickly anyway. So in the short term, our environmental monitoring focuses on the inputs, the activities, and the outputs. And we can actually learn a very great deal just at that stage of the intervention before we even get into the field to see what's happened on the environmental side. So for example, we put an offer out which is 102 actions. Just by seeing what land managers have put into their agreements, what they've selected into, what they've chosen not to do, and then going to speak to them to find out about why they've made those choices and what the barriers were. For example, we've put a new agroforestry offer out. Have farmers chosen to take that up or not, and what were the reasons for that? Just at that early stage of the logic model, we can do a huge amount of, we can gather a huge amount of evidence and learning that can lead us to improve the schemes, even before we get to the environmental outcome side of things. We can also ask them questions quite early on about how the agri-environment agreement that they've signed up for is causing them to change their behaviour on farm. We know that some farms will already, some of the best farmers will already be doing some of the practices that we're funding in the schemes, but we obviously have very high ambitions for additionality in the schemes. But by asking questions about how the farming practice is changing, we can tweak our assumptions about the extent of additionality we're getting into schemes and feed all of that into our forward-looking modelling and projection about the extent to which the schemes are going to deliver against our environmental targets. But fundamentally, when it comes to the being definitive about what outcomes have been delivered through the schemes, we need a combination of remote monitoring, which David alluded to earlier and which we're getting some of through the tNCEA, as well as field-based assessment. So I'll go on to say a little bit about how we're doing that and how the tNCEA is helping us to deliver that. So of course, to have any confidence in what the agri-environment schemes, what the ELM schemes have delivered, we need a counterfactual. So we need to be able to confidently state what might have happened if we hadn't funded a farmer to deliver some change in land management practice. So although we will be doing before and after studies through our farmers that have agreements, we need more than that. And that's where the tNCEA comes in. Because we want to know how farmers who are in a sustainable farming incentive agreement are performing, how their environmental condition is changing relative to farmers who aren't in the schemes. It is actually quite a challenge in assessing counterfactuals in agri-environment schemes because of the complexity that I mentioned, the huge diversity of farming systems, and the variety of conditions and the huge degree of factors that are going to affect outcomes. So there is a big challenge in terms of achieving sufficient scale in a counterfactual to actually be able to detect effects with the sufficient statistical power. So in terms of thinking about a counterfactual, we need sufficient scale. We need to be able to isolate effects from the confounding factors and from the background variability. And we need to be confident that we can ascribe any effects that we do measure to the intervention in the sustainable farming incentive rather than just chance. And so for that, we need something that is of sufficient scale, and the tNCEA is the vehicle that does offer that to us. So I'll just say a little bit about the particular component of the tNCEA that we're sort of thinking of for this study, although we will be drawing on the full suite of tNCEA products. So the England Ecosystem Survey is one of the key products that I think is in your brochure there. And we'll probably draw on it in three distinct ways. First of all, we can use the longitudinal data that this product will offer to augment the data that we'll be collecting ourselves as we go out to survey and interview SFI agreement holders. The tNCEA data will supplement the information that we have on those farms so that we can develop a much richer picture in terms of understanding those farms and their habitat and the condition of their natural capital. But secondly, and this is the really most valuable bit, is that because the NCEA will be surveying farmland up and down the country, we can identify the condition of habitat on farms that are not part of the scheme. We can identify how their habitat is changing. That will allow us to draw conclusions that are representative at the national scale, and we have a large sample size that allows us to derive robust conclusions. And the third aspect is that that suite of data can feed into all of our spatial and temporal models, which we are adding to all the time, bearing in mind that we're delivering against targets through to 2042, 2050, and we are constantly reviewing and assessing what the suite of delivery pathways is to get us to those targets. And as we gather that data through the NCEA and combine that with our scheme level monitoring, we will improve that forward-looking modelling to assess where we might have policy and delivery gaps and how we might need to tweak the design. So the questions that will allow us to answer are, first and foremost, have the agri-environment schemes delivered the impact as expected? What was the change produced by agri-environment schemes compared to just the underlying change that might have been happening in the broader farming landscape? What is the contribution when we get multiple clusters of agri-environment activity in a local area? So is there a landscape scale effect of agri-environment schemes? And finally, what can we understand about scheme contribution to EIP targets? The tNCEA data will be crucial for all of that. What I wanted to show is just a little picture that might help bring this to life in terms of how this will work. So this schema is a sort of a stylized diagram basically showing how the different sample sites work. So the square boxes, the orange square boxes, are the tNCEA sample sites. The pink parcels, which represent actual field boundaries, are sites where we funded an SFI intervention. And where there's a purple square box or a patch of a purple square box, that indicates where there's an overlap between what's being measured in the tNCEA and where we're funding an SFI intervention. So in the first instance, where we'll apply this is through the SFI pilot, which launched in 2021. At that time, we did an initial baseline survey, and we are just this year and into next year doing a follow-up resurvey of the SFI pilot farms. And what this allows us to do is draw very robust comparisons in terms of the change that we can see in the SFI pilot sites versus the tNCEA sites where there isn't an intervention. Now, it's obviously not just as simple as take the next neighbouring farm. We do a very systematic analysis of the characteristics of the farms to make sure we're doing a good match between in terms of building our counterfactual. But what you can see is that I hope you can see how the joint power of these data sets creates something that's much more valuable than each on their own. So if we just went and surveyed the SFI farms on their own, we wouldn't be able to say anything that's particularly convincing about attributing change to the SFI intervention. Similarly, if it was just the NCEA data on its own, we wouldn't have this scheme and the administrative data and the specific data about the funding from government in terms of driving the outcomes. So by bringing those two things together, we can really understand how effective government policy has been in driving an improvement in environmental condition, and most importantly, feed that back in to the policy design so that we can tweak the design of our actions, tweak how we're implementing the schemes, and possibly provide advice to ministers about whether we're still doing the right set of things to achieve targets or whether we need to reassess and look at different things. So just to end really with a set of future challenges, because we're just kind of rolling out this approach at the moment. I think a few people have alluded to the long-term future. So I think for us, it's about the frequency of the repeat survey. As far as possible, we'd love to have kind of regular iterations of the NCEA style data so that we can, over time, reassess ELM delivery and tweak as required. I think there is a challenge around the quality of data. We're obviously, in my area and also in David's area, you've heard about the investment that we're making in novel approaches to monitoring. But there's always going to be a role for field data to ground truth things. There is a big challenge at the moment in terms of the capacity of skilled surveyors. I think as far as possible, one of the challenges we have is moving the data from having been captured out in the field to something we can use and mobilizing that as quickly as possible. Because given the timelines that we have for our targets, there's just a huge appetite to derive those insights and use the data as quickly as possible. And then the fourth one is kind of a bit tongue-in-cheek because it would be a nice problem to have, but the ambition in the ELM schemes is to drive a system-wide change really across the farming landscape, such that if we're successful in doing that, and we have really, really high uptake of 70% of farms participating in the Sustainable Farming Incentive, it might actually raise some challenges for using the NCEA data as a counterfactual in the way I just described. That would be a very nice problem to have. We're probably several years away from that at least. And hopefully by going on this journey, capturing the NCEA data along the way, we will have, by the time we get there, hopefully we've demonstrated that the interventions are contributing in the way we were hoping and expecting that they would. So like I say, it would be a nice problem to have, and we can cross that bridge when we come to it. So that's just a brief whiz through of one application of the NCEA, but I'd be very happy to take any questions.
I can see that people are being shy. See your hand up over there. Ollie.
Hi there, Ollie Graffman from Natural England. I'm interested in the work underway to align those survey methods between the Agri-Environment Survey and the England Ecosystem Survey. And also the opportunity, so there's a number of kind of landscape scale farmland partnerships emerging across the country, and whether there's opportunities to engage with those and what data they're collecting that might also be used.
Yeah, so I mean, our teams work very, very closely together in terms of using the same protocols as far as possible, where we're collecting data. And you know, we are literally working hand in glove. So I think from our perspective, we try and layer scheme-specific monitoring on top of what the NCEA is collecting. So if the NCEA could collect it, we'd prefer them to collect it, and then we layer scheme-specific monitoring on top. So we as far as possible, we do align protocols and only collect additional things. I mean, in terms of your broader question about partnerships and gathering data from a range of sources, I mean, we're open to everything. We are aware that we're in a new landscape, really, in terms of the ambition and in terms of the specificity of targets we've got to deliver, and in terms of the level of data that we're going to need to sort of be confident that we're achieving those. At the same time, none of this monitoring comes on the cheap, so we need to turn over every stone, really, in terms of delivering it as cost effectively as possible. So we're open to all those possibilities.
I think there's a question from Gideon as well.
Thanks. Ciaran, that was a great talk. Thank you very much. I love the Cumbria example. That really brought it to life. I think you mentioned something about, I'm sort of picking up on the thing I mentioned at the beginning about the innovative ways of measuring, and yeah. You mentioned as well the potential there, but the fact that at the moment the importance of field surveyors is still critical. You mentioned again the fact that we're challenged by there's not enough of them out there, yeah. And they're expensive, and David talked about the need to bring money into this area. So I just wanted to challenge you a bit and ask you, do you have any thoughts about what might become the monitoring tools of choice that would enable you to work out how well SFI is performing, yeah. Which might move us away from some of the more expensive traditional tools eventually? Yeah, we can't do it now, but eventually.
We have a research program looking at exactly that question, and the kinds of things that we're exploring are, there's a few obvious areas like the satellite imagery, and there's a huge variety in terms of satellite imagery, in terms of the ground penetrating radar and that kind of thing. But there's a much richer set of potential as well in terms of field-mounted fixed sensors that obviously through our schemes we might ask farmers to put those in their field, or you can possibly mount a camera on a tractor, and as the tractor is going around the field, it can capture imagery which might be sent back and which we could process to measure biodiversity in the herbal layer or what have you. We're currently doing quite a lot of research to sort of develop some of those approaches as proofs of concept to then establish which of these would work at scale and deliver us the insights that we need. And I think the huge advantage is that if some of those work, they can be so much more cost effective, but also so much more timely and we get the results much faster. So I think we need a mixed economy. We're going to need some of those, and there's huge potential there, but we're still going to need some element of the sort of traditional surveying as well.
Thank you, Ciaran. Really great to hear how NCEA's data is being used. So I think you'll join me now to thank Ciaran.